Hello everyone, welcome to this video in which we'll be talking about estimating and reducing labor costs. The big important idea that I'll be introducing to you in this video is the idea of line balancing and how that matters. But first, let's talk about basics, and we'll begin with an example. We'll be talking about the example of something called a zooter. So let me get that in. So this is a zooter. A zooter is basically a high-end kick scooter which was developed by a company called Nova Cruise Inc. And that's the example I'll be using to go over this idea. Now, the zooters demand trajectory looks something like this. This is over the lifetime. So these are all products that exist that have a very limited lifespan, in the sense that they become popular for a certain while. They have a large demand for a certain while, then the demand falls down once the popularity goes away. And this was the life cycle demand trajectory for Zooter, right? It started somewhere around 100. It rose all the way up to 1300 per week at a certain time, and then came down and settled down around 100 again, right? So that's the life cycle demand for Zooter. Now, the process of assembling the Zooter is what we're going to be talking about. Now, the demand initially began at a demand of 125 units per week. Now, that's an important number that we will keep track of. And this is what the Zooter's assembly process looked like, right? Now, there were 3 workers who were working on the assembly process. All the activities of making a Zooter got split up into 3 major components. The 30 of the overall 80 parts were assembled in the first activity, and that took 13 minutes. That's the process time for the first activity. The process time for the second activity was 11 minutes. So they assemble the wheel, the brake, and some other parts of the steering mechanism. And finally, the final process, this takes 8 minutes per unit, and that's the whole assembly process. And you'll notice that there are inventories in between. So worker 1 finishes one process, takes 13 minutes, sends it to an inventory. Worker 2 picks it up from the work in process inventory and continues, and so on. So that's how this process is set up. Now, based on the analysis that we have done already so far, with all the videos and everything that and everything that we've done in class, we can calculate the capacity of this process, right? So the capacity of the process is not difficult to calculate. We calculate the capacity of each of the individual stages of the process, and then we can understand the capacity of the process. So if you're looking at capacity of activity 1, is, so it's 13 minutes per scooter to complete activity 1. So it is 0.769 scooters per minute, or 4.6 scooters per hour, right? Similarly, we can compute that the second worker's capacity is 5.45 scooters per hour, and the third worker's capacity is 7.5 scooters per hour. So 1 divided by 11, and then 1 divided by 8. That'll give us the capacities. And with this, we know that the bottleneck obviously is the first worker, who takes the longest to finish, right? And that's what we know. So the bottleneck is the first process, which is 4.6 scooters per hour. So this is the existing process that we have. Now, this process here is called a worker-paced process, right? So this is called a worker-paced process, worker-paced line, or a worker-paced process. That's the name for it. Now, the alternative is something called a machine-paced process, where everything is done by a machine, and everything is done at a continuous rate. So this is what you see in, say, car assembly lines. So there is a conveyor belt which goes through this, and there is a machine which assembles, does activity 1, and then activity 2 and activity 3. Now, I say machine, but it doesn't have to be machine. It can be a person who's doing it who's doing activity 1, person doing activity 2, and person doing activity 3. But then the conveyor belt moves at the same rate, but there is no work in process in between, right? Because there's no work in process in between, stages that are faster basically have to stop doing their work while the slower process goes on. So essentially, because each of these conveyor belts, the rate of the movement of the conveyor belt is based on the bottleneck process, and we know that the bottleneck process is activity 1. The zooter will take about 13 times 3, because there are 3 activities, 13 times 3, because the conveyor belt will be moving at a rate of 1 over 13 per hour. So that's essentially what we'll have, right? Now, this is the machine-based process. Now let's come back to the worker-based process. Now, it takes 32 minutes to make the first zooter, and this is one of the interesting things that I want you to learn from this one. So we talked about this a little bit when we talked about Kristen's Cookie Company in class last week. But the idea is that when you calculate a lot of these multiple unit production scenarios, it could be an office, it could be a actual production scenario as we have like that, like here. The first unit that goes through the process is always unique, especially if you assume that there is no work in process inventory already available. Now, in a lot of assembly lines that work overtime, work in process inventory can be left over at, say, the end of the shift, which can be picked up at the beginning of the shift next week, but the next time you start the process. But in a lot of cases, work in process gets used up at the end of the day. So you start the day with an empty assembly line. So when you have an empty assembly line, you essentially have the first process that goes through it is always going to be different. So the first scooter that goes through the system takes 32 minutes. Why does it take 32 minutes? 13 minutes for the first one, 11 minutes for the second activity, and 8 minutes for the third activity, right? The first activity has to be finished, and then the second activity, and then the third activity. So the first one takes 32 minutes, but the rest of the assembly line doesn't take that long, right? And that's the idea here. So after waiting 32 minutes for the first scooter, it takes an additional 13 minutes until the second scooter is produced, and then from then onwards, it takes every 13 minutes for every additional scooter to be produced, right? And that's the idea there. Now, the first scooter takes 32 minutes to be produced, and the second scooter will be produced at 45 minutes, the third scooter at 58 minutes, the fourth at 71, and so on. So what is the time to finish X units starting with an empty system? Now, usually we would just base it upon the 13 minutes it takes per unit, but instead you realize that the first one takes 32 minutes, and from that point onwards it takes 13 minutes. And that's the idea here. So time to finish is 32 minutes for the first plus the remaining X minus 1 units, whatever units you have, they get produced at 30 minutes per unit. So how long does it take to finish 50 units? The time will be 32 minutes for the first unit, and then for the remaining 49 units, it will be 13 minutes per unit, right? And that's the total time to finish, say, 50 units. Now, this difference is important when you have an activity, say something like this, where you're trying to, say, make 100 scooters, or say 40 scooters or 50 scooters, or some small number. Let's say that you're looking at an assembly line process that produces, say, 5 million cranberries, right? Processing 5 million cranberries. Well, something like that, the difference between the first cranberry and the remaining 4.99999 million cranberries is not going to be that different, in which case you don't need to consider this process. So it comes down to the volume that flows through a particular process. If the volume is small enough, then the first unit's time makes it's important to look at the first unit's time, otherwise it doesn't, right? So that's something to keep in mind. The first unit is always unique. That's the idea here. Okay. All right. Now let's talk about line balancing. How can we make this better, right? So to understand why line balancing is important, let's talk about what is the labor content and the idle time and everything, right? So this is something, again, something that we talked about when we did the Kristen's Cookie Company case. But what is the labor time? So the labor content is the sum of the processing times with labor. So that's 32 minutes per unit, 11. So it takes 32 minutes to make a single unit. So this is 32 minutes reflects how much time is invested in producing a single scooter, right? Now, if you assume an average hourly rate for employees at $12 per hour, now this is obviously an older book, so now it might be slightly higher than that, but let's assume that it's $12 per hour for average working hourly rate. Would the resulting labor costs then be 32 minutes times the 20 cents per minute? And the answer is obviously no, right? And the reason for this is the labor content is a measure of how long it takes to make the unit, but people are working at this on activities at the same time, and some workers have to wait while other workers have to work on a continuous process, and so on. So let's to illustrate this. So let's take worker two as an example. Worker two is not a constraint on the overall outputs process. So but still, let's look at that. So it would require the exactly 32 minutes to produce a scooter. However, if we just increase our daily wages by 33%, which we should obviously do based upon the direct labor costs that we have, what will happen exactly, right? So we found that the process capacity is 4.6 scooters per hour. So that was 0 point something scooters per minute, or 4.6 scooters per hour, or 161 scooters per week, right? But our current demand is only 125 scooters per week. So how exactly do we calculate the total labor time? Now we did this. So we looked at this a couple of weeks ago when I posted our first videos about labor costs, how you calculate labor costs and everything. The cost of direct labor is the total wages per unit time divided by flow rate, right? So we know that the wages per week is, so if it's a 35-hour work week and there are 3 workers and they are each paid $12 per hour, it's 3 times $12 times 35, which is 1,260 divided by 125 scooters per week. And so the direct labor cost is $10.08 per scooter. So that's how much we spent on this. So even though we can produce 161 scooters per week approximately, our flow rate is only 125 scooters per week because that's our demand, right? So when Nova Cruz started out, if you remember that demand curve that we saw here, when Nova Cruz started out, their demand was 125 per week. And that's what we are looking at right now, okay? And that's the direct cost, $10.08 per labor. So why is this so much higher than the number that we computed here, which was $6.40 per unit, right? Instead of the $10.08. So if we just looked at just the labor content and calculate that, why is this so much higher? Because it comes down to average labor utilization. And the average labor utilization that we have right now is we are producing is 63.5% per week, right? So the labor content is 32 minutes divided by, so this gives you the labor content per hour times the number of units that we produce per hour, and then we divide that by divided by 3 because that's the number of workers that we have, and we'll get the average labor utilization. Now obviously this is the average labor utilization, but each of the workers is working has a different labor utilization, and we can calculate that too, right? So we know, so for each of the workers, so for worker 1 it is 4.6 scooters per hour. So that's where we got the 3.57, by the way. We averaged out the time for each of the workers, how many what is exactly how many scooters we can make, right? So that's how we calculate the average utilization. So that's the reason why the cost is so high. So we are only utilizing workers up to 63.5%, and that's the reason why we need some sort of line balancing, and that's what we'll talk about next. So we are not utilizing our labor to their fullest extent. Now, the process is never able to produce more than its bottleneck, which is in this case is 1 scooter every 30 minutes. However, if you consider worker 3, they can make 8 scooters per minute, which translates to 5 minutes of idle time for every scooter that is built, right? So they are essentially waiting for 5 minutes doing nothing. So there's a 5 minute of idle, 5 minutes of idle time there. So if we look at the utilization of each of these workers individually, you'll notice that even though the average utilization was 63.5%, if we calculate them individually, for worker 1, the utilization is 77%. For worker 2 is 65.5%, and worker 3 is 47.6%. Now, the 3.57 comes from the fact that demand is 125 units per week, right? So because demand is 125 units per week, which is 3.75 units per hour, based upon that, we can calculate the utilization. So even worker 1, who is the bottleneck for this process, is going to have some idle time in the week, because we are not using the full capacity of the system. The full capacity of the system based upon the bottleneck process is 161 units approximately, but our demand is only 125 units. So if you add up all the idle time workers up across the 3 workers, it's 3.8 minutes per unit, 5.8 minutes per unit, and so on. So about 18.4 minutes per unit is the total idle time that we have here, right? And that's how we calculate the 63.5% average labor utilization. Yeah. Now, given this, what can we do, right? So what can we do to increase the capacity, first of all, and then use our worker time better? And that's what we can talk about. Okay, so the one thing we can always do is increase the efficiency of the process by utilizing various, in this case, labor. So you can maybe add more people. That's one thing that you could potentially do, right? Or you could do something slightly different, right? Now, if you consider a weekend when demand was 200 zooters per week, right? Then, even in this case, in the case when demand was 125 units per week, we saw that the utilization for worker 1 was 77%, 65.5%, and 47.6% for the 3 workers. But let's consider one of the weeks in May when demand shot up to 200 units per week. But even here, we could not produce 200 units per week, right? Because we are capacity constrained. We can only produce 161 scooters per week. We needed to produce, if demand is 200 per week, it comes out to about 5.714 units per hour. We cannot produce that because our capacity is only 161.5 scooters per week, right? Even there, if you calculate the utilization, if you do the maximum that you can do with the bottleneck, you'll notice that the capacity of the first utilization for the first activity will be 100%, but for the second activity will only be 84.6%, and the third activity will be 61.5%. That's based on the 13 minutes that you can do, right? So this will be 100%, 1 over 13 divided by 1 over 13. This will be 1 over 13 divided by 1 over 8. This will be 1 over 13 divided by 1 over 13 divided by 1 over 11, and then 1 over 13 divided by 1 over 8, right? That gives you an average utilization of 82.5%, and the cost of direct labor now has gone down to $7.8 per scooter, right? It is still more than the 6.4 that you got from just the direct labor cost, right? So if you can produce to capacity, obviously our labor costs are going to be lower because we are making more of these. Now, the best possible thing that you can do is, if you remember, you have 32 minutes of work, right? So if you can divide the 32 minutes of work between the 3 workers, which is 10.66 minutes per unit. So if you can equally divide up the activity into 3 units and each of them has the same activity time, then you can produce this at 100%. Each of the workers can work as 100% utilization, and that will have the least cost of direct labor. And that's something to keep in mind, right? But that is not always possible. So this video has already gone on for really long, so we're coming to the meat of line balancing. So instead of calling this video line balancing, I'll call it some preliminary to line balancing, and then in the next video we'll talk about line balancing, right? See you all in the next video.